gospel reading today, I wonder where your attention was focused in the parable. What caught your attention? And what twinged within you or caught your ear and eye and gave you a rush of energy or a chill of fear? Maybe you identified with the slaves who complain about the weeds and want to tear them out. Maybe it's absolutely clear in your mind what is a weed, what isn't, and assume that the master would, of course, agree with you on that distinction. So this parable gives you, a rush of righteous, zealous energy. Maybe you're a bystander. You're looking out at the field and you've got absolutely no idea how someone could tell the difference between the weeds and the wheat and would want to risk hurting them in a desire for purity and perfection, when things will be more or less good for the time being. Maybe you worry that you are wheat being swallowed by weeds, or really struggle being wheat when it seems like weeds have a better thing going on in terms of being able to achieve rampant growth. So I encourage you to, play around with the parable and place yourself within it, because I think Jesus gave it to us for that purpose, to disclose something of ourselves and something of human nature. You might wonder why Jesus would even mention weeds in relation to the kingdom of heaven, because, usually weeds are undesirable. I want to get rid of them, even though they're going to grow back in a few days. And as said, we can have a very clear idea of what is a weed and what is not. But I think we must acknowledge that we have a very limited perspective on this. Honestly, I suspect it's happened to all of us who have ever donned a pair of gardening gloves, that, in a moment of enthusiastic gardening, we've pulled out plants that we thought were weeds, and then were told after the fact they were not weeds. Now, I know for an absolute fact that I've done that, because Reverend Judith has told me, with love and gentleness and kindness. Now, a particular locality or culture, or even individual florist or horticulturalist might consider something a weed that others don't think is a weed, or can put it to good use. A lot of people consider there's a plant called baby's breath. And apparently that's a weed, and yet that is in just about every wedding or flower arrangement I've seen. It's a weed and it's put to good use. So the point is, even something as simple as weeds versus wheat, it's not as tidy. So where danger creeps in is highlighted in the inclination in the slaves in the story to, decide on those distinctions and destroy on behalf of the master. They're coming from a well-meaning place. They don't want to see a field ruined and polluted. They want to do the work of the master, and they're okay with a bit of collateral damage in the meantime. But really, this is potentially a really poisonous and dangerous position to take. And it's easy to see everywhere. It's easy to see this happen. Without knowing a person's whole story, without knowing the innumerable influences that have shaped them, for better or worse, and I sort of spoke about this a couple of weeks ago using Doctor Strange from Marvel as an example. We can come to see people as evil or bad or less than human, like a weed. A weed which is really just in the way of the good people, which is, of course, us. And the tragically long list of people who have been treated as weeds throughout history, that then, later generations have looked back on with just increasing horror and shame. It's It's appalling. But it continues now in various extremist religious and political groups. People who want to kill those they regard as enemies of God, but also in forms of discrimination. Now, I'll tell you now, I'll confess to you now, there are some people that I absolutely regard as weeds in the parabolic sense. And even with what limited knowledge that I've got, and being a pretty chill guy, I fear that there are some people I see and they're in mortal peril with God. Seriously. And there are people who commit devastating crimes as individuals, serial killers and abusers of the most vulnerable, human traffickers. And there are people whose personal crimes are arguably lesser, but whose influence, toxicity, self-absorption, unrepentant natures and disregard for truth infects large swathes of people. Mortal peril. A genuine, really. But here's where I believe the qualification is in order. I'm not suggesting that the interpretation of this parable is meant to lead us into a place of complete neutrality and unable to tell the difference between good and bad and call it out. That would be absurd. If you see someone kicking a dog in the street, you're not going to go, he might actually be wheat disguised as weed. I'll leave him be. But what I am appealing to is the extremities that could exist in our judgments. So if in hearing this parable, it raises something in your conscience with respect to your own tendency to be like the slaves or the weeds or the wheat, in a way that is a bit warped, then therein lies something for your spiritual growth. I'm appealing to your own conscience here. So if you think with certainty that you are obviously first-rate wheat, and there is a lot of first-rate wheat here, I've got to say, then focus on that. Celebrate that. Give thanks to God for that. Don't worry about wanting to destroy weeds. How many people have been certain that they are wheat, have gone about destroying weeds of all kinds, and have shown by their own very actions to be more weed than wheat themselves after all? So basically what I hear the Master saying is something like, don't be too hasty in making that distinction. You're going to get it wrong a lot of the time, and in the fullness of time, it's my job to sort out. And it's said many times, who else but God, the Master, could we trust to grasp the fullness of a person's story and assess rightly? And there's one other aspect to consider, which is it's pretty intense in the gospel. So the end-game scenario with the weeping and gnashing of teeth and the fire and all that, it draws attention to a time, I think, when through death, every single filter that divides us from God now is done away with. And we're completely and utterly exposed. And there will be, the truth of who we are and what we've done will be brought into focus in the refining fire of God's love. And coming to know Christ in this life should prepare us for that. It's like the person who has made room for Christ to be formed in them. God looks on them and sees Christ. So when I hear language of fire and that sort of thing, I do tend to think of it in terms of purifying, refining, rather than something torturous and punitive. Because seriously, you come before God and you encounter truth, completely unfiltered, all deceptions that we tell ourselves are done away with, that's going to hurt. Truth is painful. That sheer vulnerability, I think, is going to sting. It will. But again, I come back to that. First, basic assurance and trust that God is extraordinarily good. And that in Jesus, God shows us just how far God will go to call us into right relationship, redeem us, make a path for us to eternity. I've got one more paragraph left. Now there is a lot more to say about it, but always sensitively and with an awareness that, there is weed and wheat within all of us. You right, John? There is weed and wheat in all of us. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, at the end of all the days, it's God's business, not ours. And thank God for that.